Some of you may know that New York City renters will send us their DHCR rental histories asking for help deciphering them. Your rental history is going to tell you if your apartment is regulated, it's going to tell you who's lived in your apartment, what they paid, and if you are regulated, what your legal rent should be. So I got this really interesting rental history the other day, and then I thought, maybe I'm going to start a new series where I go through a rental history live and interpret it. So be sure to follow along for this series. So I've taken out all the identifying information, but I'm going to put the rental history here and I'm going to read it from my computer. So this person sent us their rental history for a Brooklyn apartment, and this was the first page. So on the first page, you can see that it was registered for the first time in 1984. All regulated apartments were only registered for the first time in 1984. This is when the history starts. And the apartment is registered as rent controlled. You can see the RC underneath the apartment status. When it was filed. So this filing was filed in 1993 and the tenant's name was George, and I took out their last name, but George lived in this apartment in 1984. And rent control is different than rent stabilization. Rent control means that George has been the same continuous tenant in that apartment since 1971. That's why he gets the rent controlled status. And his rent is $106.57. What I would do for that New York City rent. And then in all the subsequent years, it says on the history, rent control, registration not required. When you have a rent-controlled apartment, or when there's a rent-controlled apartment in a building, the landlord is not required to register it every single year in the same way they are required to register a rent-stabilized apartment. So that's number one. So on the first page, 1994 to 1997, rent control, registration not registered. And now I'm going to go to page 2. 1998 to 2012, still rent control, registration not required. Third page. 2013 to 2022, rent control, registration not required. And then it pops up again on the history as RS, rent stabilized, $4,500 a month. I have never seen a rental history like this. It is very, very cool. So usually what happens when a rent-controlled tenant leaves, likely dies, passes away, these are very elderly New Yorkers, the apartment goes from rent control to rent stabilized. That is what is supposed to happen. Now, prior to 2019, an apartment could go from rent control to rent stabilized, and if the rent hit a certain threshold, it would automatically be deregulated. And the thresholds were different numbers at different times, but right prior to 2019, the threshold was around $2,800. So as soon as the rent hit that number, it could get deregulated. That was prior to 2019. But here we see the apartment gets registered as rent stabilized at $4,500. What does that tell me? It tells me that George died or left the apartment after 2019, after the law changed, because if he died before, the apartment would have just been deregulated and it would have never had to been registered as rent stabilized. So this tenant got very, very lucky that George left the apartment after 2019, which forced the landlords to keep the apartment in rent stabilization. Now you may be thinking, oh, $106 to $4,500 is a huge jump. Are they allowed to do that? And in this case, they are allowed to do that because when an apartment goes from rent control to rent stabilized, the landlord is allowed to set the first rent. And that first rent needs to be the fair market rent for the area. Now, I looked into this building, I looked into this unit, I looked into the neighborhood, and $4,500 a month is definitely in line with what rents are going for in that area in 2023 and 2024. This is a very popular, expensive Brooklyn neighborhood. This is a very cool history. By the looks of the math and the history, George lived in this apartment for well over 50 years, which is amazing. And his rent was $100 in one of the most expensive, popular neighborhoods in New York City. So very cool. This is your friendly reminder to request your rental history if you haven't already. See if you're stabilized, see what the legal rent is. You can always send your rental history to our team by uploading it to the rent stabilization map. It's also linked in our bio. And I think I'm gonna do one of these DHCR readings at least on a weekly basis. So follow along, drop your questions in the comments.